The verdict rang through the crystalline chamber like a death knell. Exile. Kira pressed her palms against the cold metal restraints, her violet eyes fixed on the council of elders who had just sealed her fate. The eldest among them, his silver, skin gleaming under the harsh lights, spoke with the finality of winter itself. You have questioned the sacred war effort, young one. You have spoken words that poison the minds of our warriors. Therefore, you are no longer one of us. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Kira's chest tightened as she looked desperately at faces she had known since childhood. Mentors, family friends, even distant relatives. All of them now gazed upon her with the cold indifference reserved for enemies. Her own mother stood among them, tears streaming down her angular features, but she said nothing. Nothing that would save her daughter. Please, Kira whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the chamber's energy field. I only spoke the truth. Our attacks on the human colonies, they're killing innocents. Children who have nothing to do with this war. The elder's expression hardened further. Truth is what the council declares it to be. Your truth is poison. Within hours, Kira found herself stripped of her identification marks, her citizen's robes, replaced with the rough gray fabric of the condemned. They transported her to Terminus Station, a desolate outpost on the rim of civilized space, where exiles and criminals scratched out whatever existence they could manage. The station was little more than a collection of ramshackle structures clinging to the surface of an ice-covered planetoid, constantly battered by storms that could freeze flesh in minutes. The transport captain, a scarred veteran with eyes like chips of ice, shoved her toward the airlock. Terminus Station, end of the line for traitors. He paused, studying her youthful features with something that might have been pity. Word of advice, girl. Trust no one. The exiles here would sell their own shadows for a warm meal. The airlock cycled with a pneumatic hiss, and suddenly Kira stood alone on the wind-swept platform. The cold hit her like a physical wall, stealing her breath and sending shivers through her thin frame. Around her, the station sprawled in ugly functionality, corrugated metal structures, flickering neon signs advertising services she didn't want to think about, and the constant background noise of generators fighting to keep the cold at bay. For 3 days she wandered the station's maze-like corridors begging for work, food, anything. But word of her crimes had preceded her. Even among the exiles and criminals, a war traitor was beyond redemption. Doors slammed in her face. Offers of help came with prices she refused to pay. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and the station's recycled air couldn't seem to warm the chill that had settled deep in her bones. On the 4th day, the blizzard came. The station's emergency sirens wailed as winds strong enough to tear metal shrieked across the surface. Most inhabitants huddled in the deeper, more sheltered areas, but Kira had been denied access to the communal warming centers. She pressed herself against a maintenance shed on the station's outer ring, her thin clothing offering no protection against the supernatural cold. The wind picked up, hurling ice crystals like tiny daggers. Kira's vision began to blur, her thoughts becoming sluggish as hypothermia crept through her system. She thought of home, of her mother's cooking, of summer afternoons spent reading in the academy gardens. How different those memories seemed, now like scenes from someone else's life. I'm going to die here, she realized with startling clarity. Alone, forgotten, branded a traitor. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spoken out to save lives, and now she would lose her own because of it. The storm intensified, and Kira felt her consciousness beginning to fade. Her legs gave out, and she crumpled into the snow that was rapidly accumulating around the shed. As darkness claimed her, she thought she heard footsteps crunching through the snow, growing closer, but that had to be her imagination. No one would be foolish enough to venture out in a storm like this. No one would be coming for her. Let me die with dignity, she prayed to whatever forces might be listening. Let me die knowing I did the right thing. The footsteps stopped somewhere nearby, and she felt strong hands lifting her limp form. Through the haze of near unconsciousness, she caught a glimpse of a face, weathered, human, with kind eyes that seemed to hold depths of their own. Pain? Then everything went black. But she was no longer alone in the storm. Warmth. That was the first sensation that penetrated the fog of Kira's consciousness. Blessed, life-giving warmth that seemed to seep into her very bones. She became aware of soft fabric against her skin, the crackle of burning wood, and the subtle scent of something cooking. For a moment she wondered if she had died and somehow found herself in whatever afterlife awaited exiled souls. Her eyes fluttered open to reveal a low ceiling constructed of salvaged metal plates, gaps sealed, with what looked like industrial foam. A small fire burned in a makeshift hearth, its orange glow dancing across walls lined with shelves containing tools, preserved foods, and books. Actual physical books, a luxury she hadn't seen in years. "Easy there," a deep voice said from somewhere, behind her. "You've been out for nearly 2 days." Kira tried to sit up, only to discover her limbs felt like they were made of lead. She managed to turn her head enough to see a human male sitting on a rough wooden chair, stirring something in a metal pot suspended over the fire. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 40 standard years, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of weathered features that spoke of a hard life lived outdoors. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale blue like ice yet somehow warm. "Where?" Her voice came out as barely a croak. "Safe," he replied simply, not looking up from his cooking. "That's all you need to know right now." Panic shot through her system like electricity. She was alone, defenseless in the shelter of a complete stranger. A human stranger. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but her body refused to cooperate. "What do you want?" she managed to whisper. Now he did look at her, those pale eyes studying her face with an expression she couldn't read. "Want? Nothing you're thinking." He ladled some of whatever he was cooking into a bowl and moved closer. "Can you sit up? You need to eat." The smell hit her then, some kind of stew, rich and savory, making her empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. But still she hesitated. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me? Your kind hates mine." He was quiet for a long moment, settling back in his chair with the bowl in his hands. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Hate's a choice," he said finally. "I chose not to make it today." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting right now." He held out the bowl. "Eat. We'll talk when you're stronger." Kira's hands shook as she accepted the bowl, and she had to use both hands to lift the spoon to her lips. The stew was simple but delicious, some kind of protein she couldn't identify. Root vegetables, herbs that must have cost a fortune to obtain on this frozen rock. Each spoonful sent warmth spreading through her chest. "What's your name?" she asked between bites. "Davin," he replied. "Yours?" "Kira." She hesitated, then added, "I was exiled. For treason. I figured. Doesn't that bother you?" Davin was quiet, for a moment, poking at the fire with a metal rod. "Depends on what kind of treason," he said eventually. "I spoke against the war, said we were killing innocents." The words came out in a rush, as if she needed to justify herself. Human innocence. Children. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. "And for that they cast you out? War is sacred to my people." Questioning it. She shrugged, immediately regretting the movement as pain shot through her shoulders. "It's the worst crime imaginable. Sacred." The word came out flat, emotionless. That's one word for it. Over the next few hours, as Kira slowly regained her strength, she began to take in more details of her surroundings. The shelter was larger than it had first appeared, extending back into what must have been a natural cave in the rock. Everything was neat, organized, functional, the home of someone who had learned to live with very little but made the most of what he had. Davin moved around the space with quiet efficiency, checking gauges on various pieces of equipment, adjusting the fire, preparing more food. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was gentle, patient. He helped her to a small washroom he had carved out of the rock, discreetly giving her privacy while staying close enough to help if she collapsed again. "How long have you lived here?" she asked when she was settled back by the fire, wrapped in blankets that smelled of soap and wood smoke. 5 years, give or take. Alone? Mostly. That must be lonely. He glanced at her, and for a moment she thought she saw something vulnerable in those pale eyes. You get used to it, but Kira was beginning to understand that some things you never really got used to. You just learned to carry them. As night fell, though on Terminus Station the distinction was academic, Davin prepared a sleeping area for her on the far side of the shelter, piling blankets and furs to create a warm nest. "Why?" she asked again as he banked the fire for the night. This time he met her eyes directly. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he said quietly. "Even exiles, even traitors, even people who've lost everything." The way he said it made her wonder what he had lost. What choices had brought a human to this desolate place? But before she could ask, he had disappeared into the shadows of his own sleeping area, leaving her alone with the dying fire and more questions than answers. As she drifted off to sleep, truly safe sleep for the first time in weeks, she found herself thinking about his words. Hate's a choice. Such a simple concept, yet it seemed to elude entire civilizations. Perhaps there was something to be learned from this strange, solitary man who had chosen compassion over convenience. Perhaps there was hope after all. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm Kira had never experienced. Simple, purposeful, oddly comforting. Each morning Davin would wake before dawn to check his equipment and prepare a basic breakfast. He would eat in companionable silence, then disappear for hours at a time, returning with salvaged materials, trade goods, or occasionally fresh meat from whatever hardy creatures managed to survive in Terminus Station's harsh environment. At first, Kira spent these hours alone, recovering her strength and studying her surroundings with growing curiosity. The shelter was a marvel of improvised engineering. Davin had tapped into the station's geothermal systems for heat, rigged a water purification system from scavenged components, and even managed to jury-rig a small hydroponics bay where he grew fresh vegetables, a luxury beyond imagination in this frozen wasteland. "How did you learn to do all this?" she asked on her 5th day, watching him adjust the nutrient flow to his small garden. "Trial and error," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Mostly error at first. But the engineering knowledge, the technical skills. I had another life before this one." His tone suggested the subject was closed, but Kira was beginning to recognize the difference between Davin's genuine boundaries and his reflexive walls. This felt like the latter, old habit rather than real resistance. So she tried a different approach. "Will you teach me?" Now he did look at her, surprise evident in those pale blue eyes. "Teach you what?" "This. All of it. How to survive out here." She gestured around the shelter. "I can't stay here forever taking advantage of your kindness. But I don't know how to live like this." Something shifted in his expression. A softening she was learning to recognize. "You're not taking advantage," he said quietly. "But yes, I can teach you." And so began Kira's education in the art of survival. Davin proved to be a patient, thorough instructor. He showed her how to identify which salvaged components could be repurposed, how to test water for contamination, how to preserve food in the station's fluctuating temperatures. His hands were gentle when he guided hers through unfamiliar tasks, his voice steady when she made mistakes. "The key," he explained as they worked together to repair a faulty heating coil, "is to never waste anything. Everything has potential value. You just have to see it. Is that your philosophy for people?" "Too?" she asked, half joking. He paused in his work, considering her question with the seriousness he brought to everything. "Maybe," he said finally. "Everyone's broken in some way. Doesn't mean they can't be fixed." It was during their 2nd week together that Kira first heard him laugh. She had been attempting to cook dinner, a simple stew based on his recipe, but had somehow managed to burn the bottom while leaving the top completely raw. The acrid smell filled the shelter, and when Davin returned from his daily rounds to find her frantically trying to salvage the mess, he took one look at the smoking pot and burst into genuine laughter. The sound transformed his entire face, erasing years of hardship and revealing glimpses of the man he must have been before whatever tragedy had brought him to this place. Kira found herself laughing too, despite her embarrassment, and for a moment the small shelter felt warm with more than just heat from the fire. "I think," Davin said when he had recovered, "we'll be eating preserved rations tonight. I'm sorry. I followed your instructions exactly. I know you did." He was still smiling, and Kira realized it was the first time she had seen him truly relaxed. "Cooking's like everything else here. It takes practice. You'll get it." They shared the simple meal of rehydrated protein and vegetables, but Kira barely tasted the food. She was too fascinated by this new side of her rescuer. The easy way he moved when his guard was down, the warmth in his voice when he told stories about his more spectacular cooking failures, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. "What were you before?" she asked suddenly, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. The smile faded, walls reassembling themselves with practiced ease. "Someone else?" "Davin. We all have our ghosts, Kira." His voice was gentle but firm. "Some of them are better left buried." But later that night, as they sat by the fire sharing one of his precious books, a collection of ancient poetry that somehow felt perfect in the flickering light, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite identify. When, their eyes met, he didn't look away immediately as he usually did. "What?" she asked softly. "Nothing. Just..." He seemed to struggle with the words. "It's been a long time since anyone shared this space. I'd forgotten how different it feels." "Different how?" "Less empty." The simple admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Kira felt something flutter in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the quiet intensity in his pale eyes. "I'm glad I'm here," she said, meaning it more than she had meant anything in months. "So am I." They read together in comfortable silence after that, shoulders touching as they shared the book. When Kira's eyes grew heavy, Davin marked their place and helped her to her sleeping area. But as he turned to go, she caught his hand. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for saving my life. For this. For giving me something to hope for again." His hand tightened around hers for just a moment. "Everyone deserves hope, Kira. Even exiles. Even humans who live alone on frozen rocks." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, gratitude, something deeper. Maybe especially them. As she settled into sleep, Kira found herself thinking about second chances, about the strange alchemy that could transform two broken people into something resembling wholeness. Outside, the eternal wind of Terminus Station howled against the shelter walls. But inside, warmth bloomed in places she had thought frozen forever. For the first time since her exile, she looked forward to tomorrow. The storm arrived without warning on a day that had started like any other. Kira woke to the familiar sounds of Davin moving quietly around the shelter, preparing for his daily venture into the station's maze of corridors and abandoned sectors. But when she emerged from her sleeping area, she found him standing at the small viewport he had installed in the shelter's main wall, his expression grim. "What is it?" she asked, moving to stand beside him. Outside, the sky, what little could be seen through Terminus Station's atmospheric processors, had turned an ominous green-black. The wind, always present on this frozen rock, had intensified to a howl that seemed to penetrate the shelter's walls. "Major storm system," Davin said, his breath fogging the viewport's surface. "Bigger than anything I've seen in the 5 years I've been here." As if summoned by his words, the station's emergency klaxons began to wail, a bone-deep sound that reverberated through the metal corridors and made Kira's teeth ache. The automated announcement followed moments later, crackling through speakers that had seen better decades. All residents seek immediate shelter. Category 5. Atmospheric disturbance approaching. All external activities suspended until further. Notice, this is not a drill. Davin stepped back from the viewport and began moving with practiced efficiency, checking seals around the shelter's entrance, adjusting the environmental controls, securing anything that might shift if the station shook. We could be sealed in here for days, he said. Maybe longer. The prospect should have alarmed Kira, being trapped in close quarters with a man she still knew relatively little about. Instead, she felt an unexpected flutter of anticipation. Over the past weeks, their interactions had been carefully structured around the rhythms of daily survival. Davin would leave for hours, giving them both space to process the strange intimacy of shared solitude. Now, that escape valve was gone. What do we need to do? She asked. Nothing urgent. The shelter's designed for extended isolation. He paused, in his preparations, glancing at her with something that might have been nervousness. Will you be all right? With being confined like this? The question was careful, considerate, so typically Davin that it made her heart squeeze. I'll be fine, she said. Will you? He didn't answer immediately, and she realized that for all his competence and self-sufficiency, the prospect of prolonged close contact might be more challenging for him than for her. How long had it been since he'd shared space with another person for more than a few hours at a time? The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. The shelter's walls groaned under the assault of wind that must have been moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Ice crystals struck the viewport like bullets, creating a constant staccato that made conversation difficult. The lights flickered, as the power grid struggled to maintain stability. Jesus, Davin muttered, checking his instruments. Wind speeds are off the charts. They spent the first day in a kind of heightened awareness, both of them hyper-conscious of the other's presence in the suddenly contracted space. Davin busied himself with maintenance tasks that probably didn't need doing. Kira organized shelves that were already perfectly organized. They spoke in careful, polite sentences about practical matters, food supplies, water recycling, the storm's probable duration. But by the second day, as the storm showed no signs of abating, the artificial distance became impossible to maintain. The shelter, spacious enough for one person or two people careful about boundaries, began to feel intimate in ways that couldn't be avoided. They had to coordinate their movements around the small cooking area. They had to take turns in the tiny washroom. They had to navigate the careful choreography of two people trying not to touch while sharing a space barely large enough for their combined presence. It was on the third morning that Kira finally broke. She had been attempting to give Davin space by staying in her sleeping area longer than usual, but the walls seemed to be closing in. When she finally emerged, she found him sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with an expression of such profound loneliness that it took her breath away. Davin? He looked up, and she saw him struggle to reassemble his usual composure. But there were cracks in his armor now, stress fractures that 3 days of forced intimacy had widened into something she could finally see through. I'm not good at this, he said quietly. At what? Being around people. It's been a long time. Kira moved closer, settling on the floor beside his chair. You've been perfect, patient, kind. You don't understand. His voice was rough with something that might have been pain. I came here to be alone. I chose this. And now you're here. And I... He trailed off, running his hands through his graying hair. And you what? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his pale eyes that made her pulse quicken. And I don't want to be alone anymore. God help me, I don't want you to leave. The admission hung between them like a live wire, dangerous and electrifying. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the shelter, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and their own careful breathing. I don't want to leave either, Kira whispered. Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something deeper, more complex. Kira, you don't understand what you're saying. I'm not a good man. The things I've done, I don't care. You should care. Your people and mine are at war. I know. She shifted closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes, close enough to count the small scars that marked his weathered face. But we're not at war. We're here, together, and that's all that matters. For a moment he seemed frozen, suspended between desire and duty, between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out to touch her face. His fingers were warm against her skin, gentle as they traced the curve of her cheek. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Kira leaned into his touch, turning her head to press a soft kiss to his palm. The gesture seemed to break whatever restraint had been holding him back. His other hand came up to frame her face, and then he was kissing her, soft at first, hesitant, as if he couldn't quite believe this was real. But as she kissed him back, her hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt, the kiss deepened into something hungry, desperate. All the careful distance they had maintained, all the polite boundaries, crumbled like ice under sudden heat. When they finally broke apart, both, breathing hard, Davin rested his forehead against hers. "We shouldn't," he said, but his hands were still cradling her face like she was something precious. "Why not?" "Because when this storm ends, you'll remember who you are and who I am," and Kira silenced him with another kiss, pouring into it all the longing and hope and desperate affection that had been building inside her for weeks. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark with desire and something that looked almost like wonder. "I know exactly who you are," she said firmly. "You're the man who saved my life, the man who gave me hope when I had none, the man who chose compassion over hatred." She smoothed her thumbs over his cheekbones, marveling at the way he seemed to lean into the touch despite himself. "That's all I need to know." This time when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no careful restraint. There was only warmth, and wanting, and the desperate need to hold on to something good in a universe that had taken so much from both of them. The storm outside seemed to fade into white noise as they discovered each other with careful hands and whispered endearments, finding in each other's arms a sanctuary more complete than any shelter could provide. Later, as they lay entwined by the dying fire, Kira traced lazy patterns on Davin's chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The storm still raged outside, but she no longer cared how long it lasted. "No regrets?" he asked softly, his fingers combing through her hair. "None," she said firmly, then tilted her head to look at him. "You?" His answer was another kiss, soft and sure and full of promises neither of them was quite ready to voice. Outside, the storm began to show the first signs of weakening, but inside their small sanctuary, a different kind of weather was just beginning. The storm broke on the 7th day with the sudden silence that follows catastrophe. Kira woke to the absence of sound. No howling wind, no rattling walls, just the gentle hum of the shelter's life support systems and Davin's steady breathing beside her. For a moment she lay still, reluctant to break the spell of their enforced intimacy. Over the past week, they had discovered each other in ways that went far beyond the physical. Davin had shared fragments of his past, stories of a younger self who had believed in clear distinctions between right and wrong, anecdotes about places he had seen before, ending up on Terminus Station. In return, Kira had told him about her homeworld, about the academic life she had loved and lost, about the crushing weight of exile from everything she had ever known. But even in their most intimate moments, she sensed walls he hadn't yet allowed her to breach. There were shadows in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, old wounds that ran deeper than the physical scars that marked his body. "It's over," Davin said quietly, his voice rough with sleep. "The storm?" He tightened his arms around her, as if reluctant to let reality intrude. "We should check the damage to the station, see if anyone needs help." It was so like him to think of others first, even after days of isolation. Kira pressed a kiss to his collarbone, tasting salt and warmth and something uniquely him. "In a minute," she murmured. But eventually, duty called. They dressed with the awkward politeness of new lovers still negotiating boundaries. Then began the process of unsealing the shelter. The viewport revealed a landscape transformed, ice sculptures carved by impossible winds, debris scattered across the station's main thoroughfares, the skeletal remains of structures that hadn't been built to withstand such fury. Christ, Davin breathed, surveying the destruction. I need to check on the others. There were perhaps 50 permanent residents of Terminus Station, a collection of exiles, criminals, and refugees who had washed up on the galaxy's edge. Despite their isolation from each other, there was an unspoken understanding that survival sometimes required cooperation. Davin had always been one of the first to offer aid when disasters struck. They spent the morning moving through the station's damaged corridors, checking on the elderly, the sick, the unprepared. Kira watched Davin work, efficient, compassionate, asking nothing in return for his help, and felt her heart swell with something that went far beyond physical attraction. This was the man she had fallen in love with. Not perfect, still carrying his own demons, but fundamentally good in ways that transcended species or politics. It was while they were helping an elderly Rigelian repair his damaged water recycler that Kira noticed the way the old alien looked at Davin, not with gratitude, but with something that might have been recognition. When their eyes met, the Rigelian's expression shuttered closed. "Thank you for your assistance," he said formally, his voice carrying undertones that Kira couldn't quite interpret. Later, as they walked back toward their shelter, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Other residents they encountered seemed to watch Davin with a new wariness. Not fear exactly, but the careful attention one paid to a predator that had chosen to be tame. "Davin," she began, but he cut her off. "We need supplies," he said, his voice unusually clipped. "The storm depleted some of our reserves." They made their way to one of the station's few functioning markets, a collection of stalls and vendors that specialized in salvage, gray market goods and services that existed in the spaces between laws. Kira had learned to navigate these interactions by staying quiet and letting Davin handle the negotiations, but today felt different. At the third stall, while Davin was examining water purification tablets, the vendor, a scarred human woman, with cybernetic implants replacing her left eye, leaned closer to Kira. "You know who he is, don't you, girl?" she whispered. "What do you mean?" The woman's remaining eye flicked toward Davin, who was absorbed in his inspection. "Commander Davin Reese, hero of the Centauri campaign, the butcher of Kepler Station." The words hit Kira like a physical blow. She stared at the vendor, certain she had misheard. He's not. "Oh, but he is." The woman's smile was cold. "Killed more of your kind than any other human officer. They gave him medals for it before everything went to hell." Kira's world seemed to tilt on its axis. Davin, her Davin, who chose compassion over hatred, who had saved her life and taught her to hope again, was a war hero, a decorated killer of her people. "I don't believe you," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, pieces began falling into place. His technical knowledge, his survival skills, the way he moved with unconscious military precision, the shadows in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. "Believe what you want," the vendor said with a shrug. "But ask yourself, why do you think a man like that ends up alone on a rock like this? Heroes don't become hermits unless they've got some mighty big ghosts to run from." The walk back to their shelter passed in a haze of shock and growing certainty. Kira's mind raced through every conversation they'd had, every careful deflection when she'd asked about his past. How could she have been so naive? How could she have missed something so fundamental about the man she'd fallen in love with? "You're quiet," Davin observed as they sealed themselves back into their sanctuary. Kira turned to face him, studying his features as if seeing them for the first time. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see it. The military bearing he'd never quite shed, the watchful alertness of a trained soldier, the careful way he held himself that spoke of years of command. "Commander Reese," she said quietly. The name hit him like a physical blow. All the color drained from his face, and for a moment he looked like he might collapse. Then his military training reasserted itself, and his expression went carefully blank. Where did you hear that name? Does it matter? Kira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the shelter's warmth. Is it true? For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of machinery. When Davin finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. The simple admission hung between them like a chasm. Kira felt tears she hadn't expected burning behind her eyes. How many? She asked. How many what? How many of my people did you kill? Davin closed his eyes, and she saw his hands tremble before he clenched them into fists. I don't know. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. We didn't always count civilian casualties separately from military ones. Civilians. The word came out flat, lifeless. Kira, please, let me explain. Explain what? The tears were falling now, hot tracks down her cheeks. Explain how the man I love built his career on murdering my people. Explain how you held me in your arms after spending years perfecting ways to kill beings just like me. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Commander? The title came out like a curse. Tell me how it felt to be decorated for genocide. Tell me how many medals they gave you for... Stop! The word cracked like a whip, and suddenly she could see the soldier he had been. Hard, implacable, dangerous. You want to know what it was like? It was hell. Every single day was hell, and it destroyed everything I ever cared about. He turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with old pain. I had a family, Kira. A wife, a daughter. They lived on Kepler Station, a research facility supposedly civilian, but your people's intelligence had decided it was a legitimate military target. The attack came without warning. No evacuation order, no attempt to separate combatants from non-combatants. They just destroyed everything. Kira felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. Sarah was 34. Emma was 7. His voice was steady now, emotionless in the way of someone reciting unbearable facts. They were in the agricultural sector when your ships opened fire. The emergency bulkheads failed. They would have had maybe 30 seconds to understand what was happening. The silence that followed was deafening. Kira stared at his rigid back, trying to process the weight of revelation and counter-revelation. He had killed her people. Her people had killed his family. The mathematics of grief and vengeance seemed impossible to balance. After that, Davin continued in that same dead voice, I became very good at my job, very efficient. They promoted me, decorated me, called me a hero, and I let them, because killing your people was the only thing that made the pain stop, even for a little while. Until I realized I'd become the very thing that destroyed my family. A killer who couldn't see the difference between soldiers and civilians, between combatants and innocents. The final mission, there was a transport. We thought it was carrying weapons, but it was refugees. Families fleeing the war zones. His voice finally broke. I gave the order to fire. Kira sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions warring in her chest. Rage at what he had done, grief for what had been done to him. Understanding of the cycles of violence that consumed worlds and souls alike. Love for the man he had become, complicated by horror at the man he had been. How many? She whispered. 237. The number came out precise, rehearsed, clearly a figure he had memorized as penance. Including 43 children. They sat in silence as the weight of that number settled between them. Finally, Davin turned to face her, and she saw that his cheeks were wet with tears. I resigned my commission the next day. Couldn't live with what I'd become, couldn't die with what I'd done. So I came here to the edge of everything and tried to disappear. He met her eyes, and she saw in them a pain so deep it took her breath away. I chose not to hate anymore, Kira, because hate had already taken everything from me. When I found you in that storm, I saw a chance to save someone instead of destroying them. Maybe that was selfish too. Kira studied his face, the lines carved by grief, the eyes that had seen too much, the gentle hands that had once ordered the deaths of hundreds. How did you weigh a man's sins against his redemption? How did you balance the monster he had been against the savior he had become? The night you found me, she said slowly. When I asked why you helped me, I said hate was a choice. He nodded. It was the only true thing I could tell you. Everything else. I was afraid you'd see the blood on my hands. I do see it. The admission hurt to say, but it was honest. But I also see the man who spent 5 years trying to wash it off. The man who chose to save an enemy instead of leaving her to die. The man who taught me to hope again when I thought hope was dead. Kira, I don't forgive you. The words came out harsher than she intended, but she pressed on. I can't. Those people you killed, they were someone's family too, someone's children. But I also can't forgive my own people for what they did to yours. She stood up, moving to the viewport that looked out over the storm-ravaged station. Maybe that's what war really is. Not heroes and villains, just broken people breaking each other until no one remembers why it started. Behind her, she heard Davin's sharp intake of breath. So what do we do now? Kira turned back to him. This complicated man who had saved her life and stolen her heart, who carried in his past both unforgivable sins and incomprehensible losses. I don't know, she said honestly. But I know I don't want to lose you. Not after finding you. Even knowing what I am. What I've done. She crossed the room to stand before him, reaching out to take his scarred hands in hers. I know what you were, she said firmly. But I also know what you are now. And what you are now is the man I love. The kiss they shared was different from the passionate embraces of the storm, sadder, more complex, weighted with the knowledge of all they had, lost and all they might yet lose. But it was also deeper, built on truth rather than careful omissions. When they broke apart, Davin rested his forehead against hers. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Maybe not, Kira agreed, and saw him flinch. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is what we choose to do with the time we have left. Outside their shelter, Terminus Station was slowly returning to life. Beings from dozens of worlds were emerging from their hiding places, beginning the work of rebuilding, of surviving another day in exile. And inside their small sanctuary, two people who should have been enemies were choosing love over hatred, hope over despair, a shared future over the ghosts of their separate pasts. It wouldn't be easy. There would be days when the weight of history threatened to crush them, when the mathematics of grief seemed impossible to balance. But they would face those days together, two refugees from a war that had consumed everything they once knew, building something new from the ashes of what they had lost. In the end, perhaps that was the only victory that mattered. Not the triumph of one side over another, but the quiet rebellion of two hearts refusing to let hatred have the final word. The storm was over. The real work was just beginning. The end.